Welcome to the Atheist in Recovery podcast, where we talk about finding hope in recovery. And now your host, Dr. Idina Silvestri.
Bonjour, guys, and welcome to episode 40 of the Atheists in Recovery podcast. And today we have sobriety lifestyle blogger Laura Silverman on. And we talk a lot about mental health and how she battled her mental health with substances, as is a very common story that we hear on the podcast and elsewhere. But she takes it a step further and she talks about what recovery looks like for her now during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I hope that you find some of the resources that we talk about helpful. So, on to our guest, Laura Silverman. Laura got sober in July of 2007 after a 6-year roller coaster ride of binge drinking to cope with mental health issues. Since then, she's created a patchwork recovery that works for her. Therapy, nature, self-love, music, relationships that matter, recovery memoirs, and personal development books, dabbling in different recovery programs, and sobriety online. In 2015, Laura started a sobriety lifestyle blog that celebrates alternative modes of recovery and sobriety called the Sobriety Collective, which showcases sober creatives worldwide and has hundreds of resources for people wanting to connect with others and get help. Laura helped to start Washington, D.C. chapter of Stan's Bar, which is a sober bar, and recently launched Booze Free in D.C., a website to showcase sober-friendly restaurants, bars, wellness activities, concert venues, and events around town. She's a karaoke rock star, member of Free State Roller Derby. Her derby name is Karaoke Queen. Hopefully I got that right. And she loves spending time with her family and friends. Laura's spirit is wonderful, and I hope that you enjoy the show. Laura Silverman, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Hi.
So I want to start this conversation by inquiring about your spiritual background from childhood.
Oof. Okay. Yeah. Well, let's just get right into it then.
Yeah, let's not waste any time.
So I was raised in a Reform Jewish family, but like very lax Reform. My parents each grew up in a Reform family and ironically met in Israel on a kibbutz, but it was more because it was like the early 70s and people were doing that kind of thing. And they got the bug for international travel. And so my dad, long story short, ended up becoming a foreign service diplomat. And we lived abroad most of my childhood. And so besides living in the States for 4 years, the rest of my childhood was spent overseas. And so there really weren't any synagogues overseas where we were anyway. And we kept up traditions. And I know you asked about spiritual, not religious, but you know, it sort of ties in and we'll get there too. But we kept up a lot of traditions. As a matter of fact, I think today is the first day of Passover, I think. I don't even know. But we kept up like Passover and Hanukkah as a family. And then it over time just became Hanukkah. And then over time it became Thanksgiving and New Year's. And so Thanksgiving is our biggest family holiday. And so we've sort of become like secular Jewish, culturally Jewish as sort of a quote unquote religious identity. But since I was little, I think like I've always had this like connection to nature. Mm-hmm. And I certainly didn't know how to articulate it when I was younger. But as I got older, I definitely felt more of a connection to what I now call the universe when I'm surrounded by natural surroundings. That sounds redundant. And I'm surrounded by surroundings.
Yeah.
So, you know, sometimes now I say like nature is my house of worship or whatever, but it's that place where I feel both infinitesimally small and tiny and almost like insignificant, but also connected to something so huge and beyond my understanding. And so I definitely still have secular and cultural Judaism in me, which will always be in me and I have pride in, but I definitely feel more of this sort of spiritual connection to natural surroundings. And then I did get into a lot of research over the past maybe like 5 to 8 years on Eastern philosophies. And so I'm really, really into Buddhism light and Taoism light. Like, I'm not a full-fledged practitioner, but I love elements of those philosophies. And I think that they work really well with sort of my current outlook.
Yeah. So I asked this question, maybe 99% of the time. And one individual actually said that he now considers himself Christo-Buddhist.
Interesting.
And I thought, well, that's an interesting combination, and I love it.
Yeah. There's a term out there that exists for like, it's either Bood Jews or Jew Boos. It's like Jewish and Buddhist combined. But I've understood, like, in my research, that that's actually quite a common thing for many, especially Reform, but many folks of the Jewish religious sort of persuasion who may not feel as connected to their religion, but definitely to their cultural heritage.
Yeah.
A foray into exploring Buddhist philosophies. And I just think it's more spiritual than religious. It definitely allows for more like questioning and curiosity. So more like maybe agnosticism as opposed to anything else.
Yeah. And the beautiful part about it is you can change your mind. Yeah. You don't have to be stuck into one little box, right?
Yeah.
But I love the idea that, you still have this Judaism, this cultural Judaism with you, because and correct me if I'm wrong, but it had a lot to do, I feel like, with your formative identity,
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I did spend a few years going to Hebrew school and just learning. And I think it's important to keep, not necessarily, I mean, I am on a podcast called Atheists in Recovery, so it's not necessarily about keeping religion alive per se, but it's definitely about keeping traditions and what's important to families and to cultural groups. So it definitely was part of my formative years, although having sort of a lack of a Jewish identity living overseas also contributed to where I am now. So I think it's all been a blend, really.
Yeah, thanks for that.
Yeah.
So I thought we would talk a little bit now about your recovery journey. And so I was perusing the pages of your website, and you just go deep. I mean, there's like, you talk about everything and anything, and it's, you're just so vulnerable in your website. And so I'm sure that helps so many people.
Thank you.
You say, I battled with anxiety, OCD, and panic attacks throughout my childhood and teen years. And when I got to college, I wanted to shed that old identity and become a more fun version of myself.
Yeah. Quote unquote fun, right? Yeah, it's just, I've had underlying mental health issues really as far back as I can remember. And I'm sure a lot of people who have recovery journeys feel similarly, only because I've heard them say these things, that, when you're growing up, you kind of feel like something's missing, like something's not there. You feel very like not a part of, no sense of belonging. And so not only did I feel sort of ostracized from social circles because I was usually one of the only foreigners in my school, not the only, but definitely one of the only, but I also felt this like otherness that I definitely did not know how to put into words or even comprehend myself until looking back, because hindsight's always 20/20. So I think that otherness definitely like melted away. I sound like a cliche, but it melted away when I had alcohol for the first time. Like I just felt like this is what it feels like to belong, not only with others, but like with myself, which I know now is a misguided way of thinking. But then it really felt like I had arrived, but not just like in a quote unquote popular and cool way. And I did feel more of that too, because I was bullied and quote unquote uncool for so long in my childhood. And so I felt very much like I was one of the cool kids, but I also felt like I had gotten to more of a sense of belonging with myself through that action of drinking and having underlying anxiety basically all the time.
Yeah.
You don't want to feel that. And because I didn't have a bunch of healthy coping tools in my toolbox, I went with a maladaptive tool, which was drinking, and I felt better. So, I mean, yeah, I was self-medicating, but I didn't know it. And so, yeah, I definitely felt like that, what I've heard of it back in the day when I was in a 12-step program forever ago, I've heard of this thing called a God-sized like hole or something in, in someone that like was filled once they had alcohol or drugs or something like, so it's a, the whole spiritual condition or what have you. That is like for a lot of people who struggle or have struggled with alcohol or drugs, either in addiction or substance use disorder. Certainly not everyone who's struggled is, classified as a quote unquote alcoholic or addict, but I definitely felt like drinking made me feel more whole.
Yeah.
Until it didn't. And that's the whole reason why I'm sober and in recovery now, right? Because at one point, well, many a point in my journey, it just wasn't working anymore, but I didn't have like a commitment to a new way of living, to healthier coping. I didn't have a commitment. So I would stop and then go back to drinking. I would stop. Sometimes I would stop for a week. Sometimes I would stop for several months, but I never could continue it because I didn't actually have a plan of like, this is going to be my new way of living. And also I was really young.
How old were you? Sorry to interrupt.
When I quit drinking for good, I had only just turned 24. So it just didn't seem like it was possible to not drink.
Yeah.
And it also, the way I was living wasn't possible to continue drinking. So I was very much stuck in this, I can't keep drinking and I can't live without drinking kind of loop. And so I had my first hospitalization when I was 22 and like 22 and a half. And that really scared the bejesus out of me. And I stopped for a bit, but again, because I was saying I didn't have like a plan. Then I eventually went back to drinking. And also I felt like I was way too young to even consider an alternative. So my second hospitalization is what like really shook me. And I was like, this is when I need to make a change. I just didn't know what it was going to be yet.
How old were you
at the second one? 24.
So, yeah.
That's when I quit. And again, that's pretty young. And I just, it didn't feel like I could like live a life without partying.
Well, that's yes. I think that maybe we should spend a few minutes on that because I had the author Catherine Gray on I had her on last week and she talked a lot about that. She said, I wasn't homeless, I wasn't drinking out of a paper bag. And so I didn't think that I had a problem. And that's sometimes where our minds go, right? You have to hit rock bottom.
Yeah.
In order to say that, maybe I need to have a better awareness of what's going on here.
Yeah. So like, sort of to speak to that, I had an apartment. Well, I was not an apartment. I was living in a house with some friends, but I mean, I had a safe place to live. I had a job. I was a quote unquote yuppie. And so it just didn't compute for me. But what I did know was that I had like a big sort of life altering event. So it wasn't just like, and I've met many women and men that have just sort of woken up one day and said, no more, like not again. For me though, I did have sort of this life altering experience where I was hospitalized in a city I had never been to before. I was separated. It was very dramatic. And I think I needed that element of drama to really shake me to my core, because if I didn't, I could have just continued on. And I do believe, because it had gotten progressively worse in a short amount of time, it could have gotten so much worse had I been lucky enough to survive through it, because not everyone is that lucky. So I'm really fortunate that I got the wake-up call that I needed, and I sought help because I didn't know what else to do. And I didn't think it was going to be a forever thing either. I was like, I need to control where I am right now. I need to just stop right now, and I need help. But I didn't think of this as like my life forever and ever. It just seemed way too daunting, the prospect to like be sober for the rest of my life.
Right. And You're 24.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how do you socialize?
Like the brain hasn't even fully developed at 24. You how do you date? How do you hang out with friends? Like everyone, not everyone, but like everyone drinks, And so I definitely felt like life as I knew it was over. And you know what? Life as I knew it was over. But that allowed me to live a different kind of life. And it took a long time. I mean, it's been well over a decade of growing up in sobriety, really. I was a kid in essence when I got sober. Maybe in some cultures, 24 is definitely a grown up and you have kids, but I feel like in the United States, 24 is definitely still a kid.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how it started for me.
Maybe talk a little bit now, Laura, about your recovery. How would you say recovery sort of helped you gain awareness in your life? Because, you're 24, you're newly sober. Yeah. How did that play out?
So, for me, recovery wasn't and isn't possible if I'm still drinking, for me. So I know that other people, they've had lapses and come back and lapses and come back. And that must be really challenging. And I really give them a lot of credit for being able to just kind of come back to that sort of sense of equilibrium. Fortunately for me, I've been able to be continuously sober, which has helped me with my recovery. And, I can't be in recovery and have a sense of awareness and peace and growth if I am still drinking. So first and foremost, abstinence is key.
Yeah.
Total abstinence from alcohol. And then when I'm there, I can start, exploring different parts of my life that I need to explore. And of course, I'm not perfect. No one is. So there are always things that I'm always working on. But I think just kind of not drinking is the biggest starting point so that I can uncover other things that I was drinking over, not realizing it, of course. So my mental health, for instance, is a huge component of my life and my recovery. And so I didn't really know how to put it into words back in my drinking days, but I had generalized anxiety, I had panic disorder, I had obsessive compulsive disorder. I still do, but it's managed now with, I actually should probably find a new therapist, but with therapy, with medication, which is something that I need, and with exercise and a self-care toolbox, reading and writing and exercising and having positive influences in my life, like my family and friends, and just learning. And then, that sort of spiritual journey for me, which is very based in nature and Eastern philosophies and less sort of religious, but more sort of attached to a grander sort of universe. And I think one of the things that I really struggled with in early recovery, early sobriety, was feeling like I had to be pigeonholed into what other people thought recovery looked like, and feeling like it didn't, I just didn't feel like it worked for me. So I'll just be totally frank. I was in a 12-step program for a while, and I never bashed them because I know that Alcoholics Anonymous helps millions of people. It doesn't help millions of people, but it helps millions of people. So, and it helped me. So in my earliest sobriety, my early recovery, it did give me a foundation that I will always be grateful for. And I did work the 12 steps, which never thought I would, but I did. And it gave me so much, and a huge element of peace with what I had done and where I was now at the time. And so, I was able to make amends with people that I'd hurt and make amends with myself. There were a lot of things that I don't regret from being an Alcoholics Anonymous. And that being said, and so it's really important for me to respect sort of the grandfather of recovery without being overly. So there are people who are blindly love it or blindly hate it, or something, along those lines. But I don't have nasty vitriol for the program, but I also don't love it. And I always recommend it as an option for people, but it's not the only way. And that's the thing, like back in 2007, it wasn't the only way either, but it was the only way that was ever told for me. Like it was what was laid out for me. And if it didn't work out for me, then I felt like something was wrong with me. And so that's kind of where I don't regret my time in the program, but I knew that there was something more out there for me. And I felt really alien and really, again, I felt ostracized because I didn't feel like I belonged there anymore. And I didn't know where else to go. Like if I wasn't doing AA and I was still sober, in my book, I was still sober and in recovery, but like I kept going back to this language, like, you know, those who don't get it are unfortunates and white knuckling their way. And I just felt like I was going to be judged again for not being part of that community. So,
right. The stigma is bad enough,
I know.
you know, when you label yourself as an alcoholic, but, you know, then you have the double stigma of saying like you might not be doing it right.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's exactly how I felt. And, you know, I would go to meetings because I wanted to be there, not because I had to be there. And then it started to be like I didn't want to be there as much anymore. So I kind of tapered down. And then I found myself in a position where I was like, I really got a lot out of this. I don't want to be here anymore. I'm ready to like level up my life in a different way. And that's what I did. But definitely felt like there was no one else, like no one else in the world like me who could understand. And that's because I had never looked it up on the internet. But also the internet when I was first starting out was very like internet 1.0. It wasn't like fancy, you know, blogs and podcasts. And
there were probably no podcasts. I mean, there probably were some podcasts, but I can't imagine that there are any that like there are now.
Nothing in 2007. And then really only like when I started the Sobriety Collective, which is what I started back in 2015, that was sort of the year, I think, 2015, where all these recovery online sites and podcasts and blogs started to really pop up. That's only 5 years ago. So we've seen like a lot change in just a short amount of time. Yeah.
So maybe now is a good segue to talk about your Sobriety Collective and why did you start it and how is it helping people?
So I started it in 2015. I was coming up on 8 years of sobriety and what I sort of called my third stage or third wave of recovery. I mean, I have no real reason.
What were the first two?
Well, the first stage was early sobriety.
Okay.
The second stage was, because I started working the steps at 3 years of sobriety, not when I was brand new. So that was my second wave of like being in the program. And then my third wave was like, but I'd already like, I'd left like nothing's official, but like I had stopped going probably like 3 or 4 years before I started the blog. So I had like different little mini phases. And anyway, this was like, I had this like, it sounds really cliched now, again, thinking about it, but I was like, I have this brilliant idea. I'm going to share people's stories. It's going to be so great. And that's what everyone does. But I was like, I really wanted to speak more publicly about my story and to show people that you don't have to be, you certainly can be, but you don't have to be in 12-step programs to be in recovery. And recovery can mean so many different things. I didn't see a lot talked about, mental health going along with substance use. And I didn't really feel like I saw myself represented in what was out there. And so I was like, I want to find other people like me, if that even exists. So that's how that started. And at first it was just like a basic blog. It didn't really like have a focus. And then I realized I wanted to do two things and two things well. One was have a boatload of resources for people who either wanted to find ways to connect with others and listen to podcasts and read blogs and discover cool like Instagram accounts, read books, coaching programs, what have you, like lots of resources that way.
Okay. And
I wanted people to also have ways to actually get help if they needed it for either their substance use or their mental health that wasn't a treatment center, like a rehab directory that was like a legitimate source, maybe from SAMHSA, maybe from NAMI, like have sources of support for people and they can do their own research. You don't have to be in only one thing to be in recovery or to get help. Like you can do multiple things. So I wanted that out there. And then I wanted to find other people like me, and I kind of label myself as a creative. I dabble in a lot of different things, but I'm very like into web design and music and writing. I don't consider myself the best writer out there, but I definitely like writing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was like, well, you know how there's this definitely like a misconception or misperception about creativity sort of dying when alcohol and drugs are out of the equation, because we have this sort of romanticized idea of
Yes.
tortured artist, a tortured writer who's an alcoholic or who's a drug addict, and only then can they produce these works of art and these works of like great literature. And I wanted to show that was absolutely not the case, that like you can get sober, you can put the drugs down, you may never have even started using, but you can be, a phenomenal creative. And so I wanted to share stories of creatives who identified as sober or in recovery all around the world, who may not have necessarily been traditionally like creative in terms of like an artist, but may be a comedian or an entrepreneur or an athlete, or they're doing something, they have some sort of creative output, and they're open about their stories. So many websites out there. I promise, Adina, I'm not like knocking them, but I see a lot of like Joe H tells his story and Nina C is in recovery. Like I wanted people to use their names. Wasn't going to force them, but like the whole point was like getting out of the shadows of the stigma.
Right.
There's a stigma of being an alcoholic or an addict or someone with a drug or alcohol problem, but why should the stigma continue into recovery as well? So I wanted to help shatter that stigma by sharing openly. And some people didn't want to use their name.
I was going to say, how was the reaction to that? Because I feel like that goes against some of the rules of
it
AA.
goes against the rules of AA. And I was trying to sort of separate myself from AA. So one of the things that I did learn is that anonymity really exists for sort of the protection of the program. You can't be a spokesperson for the program, but like it doesn't mean that you have to be anonymous about your recovery. You just don't share what you hear in meetings with other people, because that is a sacred space, but it doesn't mean you can't be open about your recovery and use your full name. Like if I was still in the program, I could be Laura Silverman, who is in recovery out loud, but in the privacy of a meeting, I am Laura, an alcoholic, and what I see here and hear here stays here kind of thing.
Right.
But the idea was very sort of twisted, and I think a lot of people assumed that it meant that you could not be open about your recovery online or anywhere because of this sort of like pervasive culture of anonymity. But I really think that it's meant to more protect what you see and hear in meetings, and protect sort of the program from being like, sometimes it doesn't work for people, but that's not necessarily anyone's fault. It's just what it is. And so I just wanted there to be like that veil of anonymity lifted. And if it didn't really work for someone, there was probably another site out there that would be more their speed. And I was all about sharing out loud, and that's important to me. And that's the community that I want to build.
Yeah. And I'm sure it's helped you.
Absolutely. Because the more people that are coming out of the shadows, and they're not really in the shadows anymore, but the more people that are out there about their stories, other people can see themselves in that. And, oh, look, that person's a fashion designer, or that person owns their own company, or they're like a creative at an ad agency, or like they're a college professor or whatever. Like you can see yourself in these people. And I think that's really the power of it, that people are sharing sort of like loudly and proudly, and helping to erase the stigma, sort of one story at a time.
Yeah, thanks for that. So as we record this podcast, we are in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, and I thought we could talk a little bit about what recovery might look like when you have to self-isolate.
Oof, yeah.
I know.
Well, I'll just be honest. I've been struggling a little bit, not with recovery, but with, well, I guess it's all really intertwined and interrelated with my I miss my family. I miss my friends. I miss going places. I miss hugs. And I live alone. I'm grateful that I live alone because I could be living in a situation that I didn't feel safe in or didn't like people.
Right.
So I do have like definite silver linings with that. And, you know, for the most part, like my health is good, my sanity is good, and I'm still really struggling. So I think that's okay to just say that, like, this is hard. No matter what your experience is, you could be a healthcare worker, you could be a patient, you could be living on the streets, you could be, you know, in a mansion. Obviously, there's a lot of like systemic inequality that is being exposed by
Right.
that's a topic for a whole different
Another,
podcast.
yeah. Right.
But I think what's important for me, especially to like be gentle and kind with myself, is that I may have a lot of things that are going well in my life, and it's still okay that I feel lonely and isolated and fearful, because no one knows if this is going to be, you know, another month or another 3 months, and like, what are the long-term effects of like not having a hug? And then obviously the economy is like, excuse my French, but it's like a total shit show right now. And they're
A total shit show.
Like,
yeah.
So it's like, there's a lot. And even almost 13 years into sobriety, like I'm not worried about drinking right now, but I'm worried a little bit about just like my mental health and being isolated so long. I mean, I do like 5 billion Zoom and FaceTime calls all the time.
That's a lot, Laura. 5 billion.
My favorite number to use, but just kind of a ridiculous amount to stay connected to family and friends. And then of course, like, you know, you've got your work Zoom calls and your fun Zoom calls, but like, it just doesn't replace, obviously, like real face-to-face hanging out with friends and family and even colleagues. So it's been difficult for sure. And I really feel for people who are, you know, trying to get sober at this time or struggling with substances at this time. I do know that there's this sort of glorified drinking culture going on where, you know, bars and restaurants, because they are trying to stay afloat, I'm not hating them for that, but they're delivering booze and making it very easy for people to drink or overdrink. You know, liquor stores have been considered essential. I think I heard it from someone on the internet which makes it true. Just kidding. You know, fortunately, I never actually had withdrawal symptoms, but I understand that those can be very dangerous and not advised to go through solo. So like, I think in that context, liquor may be necessary so that you're not dying from withdrawal. But I struggle to think of how a liquor store is like truly an essential service during this time. So anyway, but yeah, I mean, lots of people are drinking a lot now, and I'm grateful that I am sober and very like secure in my sobriety right now. But I am sort of, you know, day to day, like my mental health can be great one day and down the next. And I just have to, that's where I really take things one day at a time.
Yes.
Yesterday was hard. I was feeling really low. I went outside for a long walk, which felt really good, but I felt this like, I was really bloated, which didn't help. So I felt this like unease of just being so full.
Okay.
And then just like being sad and depressed. And I came back to my apartment and I just didn't feel good. And I was like, you know what? That's okay. This is going to pass. There are a lot of isms from my time in the program that have stuck with me because they're sort of cliched but true. Like one day at a time. It's really just kind of like living life each day. You can't live in the future. This too shall pass. Like everything is sort of impermanent. That's also a Buddhist philosophy. Like nothing is permanent.
I use that one. This too shall pass.
Yeah. So there are little things that I have to remind myself that this may seem like a really, really big deal, and it is. And it's not going to last forever. It just feels like it is because it's our current situation. We've never been through this before as a society in modern times. And we're not used to like not going places and not seeing people. And so it's just, it definitely feels like forever, but it's not going to be. Better not be. Better not be.
Right. I mean, I do think that a lot is going to come out of this. Hopefully a lot of positive will come out of this. You know, I feel like whenever you look at times that are incredibly challenging, you know, the research shows that usually there's something that you could take from it, whether it's you become stronger and more resilient, or you become more adaptive, or, you're reprioritizing what's important once, you come out of it.
Yeah.
That's what I'm hoping for. Yeah.
I've thought about that a lot too, that like we have to be able to take some lessons from this, because there's been such a cost of human life already. And
right.
It would be such an enormous travesty and tragedy if we couldn't learn from this on a larger scale and be kinder to each other and sort of forget quote unquote petty things between nations, between communities, because I do like to search for meaning in things, and sometimes it's just not possible, but I will try, gosh darn it.
You know what book I love, and it seems to be incredibly relevant during this time, is Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning.
I have that by my bedside, and I'm embarrassed to say that like I'm halfway through it and I haven't finished it. And I started it a long time ago, so I'm gonna get back into it. That's absolutely true.
Well, as we wrap up our show today, I was hoping that you could tell the folks a little bit more about how to best find you and some of the awesome projects that you have going on currently.
Absolutely. So obviously with COVID going on, there's not a lot of like in-person get-togethers lately, but there are a couple ways that people can find me and reach out to me. And there's nothing that I love more than connecting with new people. So first and foremost, on Instagram, I'm at We Are Sober and at Booze Free in DC. So I'm in the DC area. I recently started sort of this travel guide, which doesn't apply much, but a travel guide to the DC area of being booze free and doing all sorts of cool and fun things in the area. But I've sort of pivoted and created a guide for people who are in the area and how can they take advantage of different elements of what the DC area has to offer from a quarantined perspective. So if you go on Booze Free in DC on Instagram, you can find the link to that. We Are Sober is my own personal one, and I love connecting with people through that. The sobrietycollective.com has been a little neglected lately. I need to make some updates, but that still exists and is there for people. boozefreeindc.com. And then a shout out to Chris Marshall, my dear friend, creator of Sans Bar and co-creator with me of Zero Proof Nation. And so follow us on Instagram at Zero Proof Nation. We share some of the best and brightest zero proof beverage brands across the country and sort of internationally as well. And then different zero proof events and people who are sort of sharing what they do. And as a matter of fact, if you're down for it, we'd certainly love to share some of your top picks if you want to be featured, Idina. I can send you the Google form just in case.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure. Why not?
So yeah, we definitely love sharing people, places, beverages, events, so that people can get some really cool ideas on things that they can drink. And, gone are the days where it's just seltzer water and diet.
Thank God.
But there's nothing wrong. If people want those, they can have them. But we just want to provide other options for people. So that is basically the gist of my life.
Well, I know that's not basically the gist, but that's all we have time for today. So you'll just have to come back.
True. Exactly. So.
All right, Miss Laura. Well, thanks again for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it. And I really appreciate anyone who's listening right now. Whatever brought them here, I'm here with you. We're here with you. And we'll get through this.
Thank you for listening to the Atheists in Recovery podcast. For more great info and to stay up to date, head over to atheistsandrecovery.com.